We're going to look quickly at primary and secondary sources. When we study history, one way to look at what happened in the past is to look at things such as documents and books and other kinds of artifacts. Some of those resources that historians use are called primary sources and others are called secondary sources. So here I have two primary sources in this example. I have some shoes from China, the actual physical shoe, and I have part of the Emancipation Proclamation, the document that freed enslaved people. We want to look at the difference between a primary and a secondary source and see why that's important. So a primary source is something that was created at the time of the event, and it came from someone who was there to see or experience it. We're in a pandemic right now. If you're watching this video in 2020, hopefully if you're watching this video in the future, the pandemic is long past. But if you are watching a newscast right now, if you're being interviewed right now about the pandemic, if you're seeing signs about masking, those are all artifacts that are primary sources because they are right now in the event being experienced by you. And we'll look at some other primary sources. So things such as photographs, videos, diaries, art, newspapers, these can all be primary sources. So Anne Frank's diary, she wrote it, it was been published. This is a primary source. This is her experiences. This is a bowl from the Han Dynasty in China. This is an actual physical artifact from the time period. You can investigate it. It was made by the person. It comes from the time period in question. Mona Lisa, so this is a piece of art, but because the art was created in a certain time period, if you wanted to study that specific time period, you could use this art as a primary source. Article, and this is a photograph of the Dust Bowl actually happening, which is when all the topsoil in the Midwest was kind of blown away by lack of proper irrigation and farming techniques. So that's photographs showing the actual event in the time that it occurred. They're all primary sources. Secondary sources are things that are created after the primary source. They're created by someone who was not there to see the event at the time. So we're doing, like I said, we have lots of pandemic things going on right now, but let's say in 20 years, somebody is going to make a documentary about the pandemic. That documentary is not taking place at the time of the pandemic. So it is then a secondary source. It might be using secondary sources. It might be using old video footage. It might produce an old masking sign. Hopefully these are old by then. It might use interviews from people who had experienced it in the past. But because the documentary is not being made in the time period that the pandemic is occurring, it's a secondary source. And it's using primary sources. That's why I have here, it was created after a primary source. Secondary sources are usually researched. They're using a primary source to get their information. Some examples of secondary sources here would be a documentary. This one's a documentary about the Vietnam War. A textbook. Textbooks are all secondary sources. Online textbooks, physical textbooks, they're all about the event using other sources. This is song lyrics. It's a good song. It's by Mumford and Sons. It's a song about the Dust Bowl. So we have a secondary source about the Dust Bowl, and this is a biography. It's not an autobiography. This is a biography of York. York was the one enslaved person who went on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he was the only person who, upon completion of the expedition, did not receive a land or a money grant. He was actually re-enslaved. He lived basically as a free person during the expedition and then was re-enslaved after that and didn't see his family, and I believe a lot of his history is lost. So he did not write an autobiography. He was enslaved. This is somebody who wrote this about him after the fact. So those are some examples of secondary sources. And why is it important to know the difference? So when you're looking at a secondary source, it's kind of important to keep in mind that someone is putting their own perspective on it. It's been passed down for a long period of time away from the original event. So it's kind of like playing telephone when you're a kid. The first person has the information, the message, but it's being passed down the line and it loses clarity and it gets a little distorted sometimes. So going back to the primary source is kind of like going back to the first person in the telephone game to see what was actually said. Now, we need to keep in mind that people have their own perspectives, so you're not always getting, let me move this picture out of the way, you're not always getting, you're still getting bias and different people's point of view in a primary source. So I don't want you to think that a primary source is free of bias. This, for instance, is a secondary source. This is an artwork showing a Canadian explorer, Alexander Mackenzie, from 1793, but the person who made this piece of art lived in the 1800s. So he was influenced by his world, by his time period when he made this piece of art that was supposed to be depicting a historical event. So we're going to do a quick little practice here looking at some artifacts from Japanese internment, which was internment camps were basically concentration camps that the US run that required all people of Japanese ancestry to be housed in these camps during World War II. They, lost their businesses, they lost their homes, they were required to be here. This is a memorial created, I think maybe 5 years ago. It has carvings, it has information about the Japanese internment. This is a secondary source. It was made from primary sources, but it is not made in the moment by somebody who experienced internment. It was done about 70 years later by somebody who was interviewing people. This is a newspaper article. So the newspaper article, even though it's a photograph of the newspaper article, is a primary source. It is from the time period of the event. This is instructions that would have been taped to and pasted to like storefronts and poles and things, giving Japanese, oops, I guess they're not going to go in order there, giving Japanese people instructions of what they need to do in order to become interred. So this is a primary source. It's a document from the time. This is a documentary. It is about people's experiences in the internment camps. So it is a secondary source because it is going back to those primary sources to get information from them and making its own news source. So it's a secondary. And this is a photograph of an internment camp from the time period. Let me move out of the way then. So this is a primary source, primary sources and secondary sources. And so again, keep in mind that the sources do have their own perspectives and bias, but they're the perspectives and bias of the people experiencing them at the time compared to being translated through time by somebody else.